Hi everyone, I'm Renee Hiatt of Sew on the Go. Today is Tutorial Tuesday and it is week 12. Thank you for joining me. As if you couldn't tell, heat and humidity has arrived in Connecticut. The curls are officially uncontrollable. So thank you for joining me on this summer day. Today we're going to talk about bindings. There is a lot to talk about on bindings. I've been overwhelmed with the number of emails and comments that I've received on my Facebook groups. So I decided to do a series. Um, I just couldn't get over the number of different types of bindings and the questions related to those. So I've done a little research and I think it's going to make a great series for us for a couple weeks. So I'm going to get started. So as we talked about this week, we're talking bindings. Today I'm going to cover the different types of bindings. There's traditional bindings, alternative options, some specialty options. There's really three grain lines for bindings that we want to think about. We're going to do a little bit on calculating your binding length and yardage. We'll cover more of those each week when we go through the different types of bindings. And we're going to talk about selecting your binding fabric and then what to expect for next week. So the types of bindings are really endless. If you don't believe me, do a Google search on it. I think you'll be overwhelmed. Not only are there an endless number of different types of bindings, but then how to put those bindings on. So for a couple of those in the upcoming weeks. So the first binding that I want to talk to you about is the double fold binding, sometimes referred to as the French fold binding. I would say that this is the most used and I find it to be the most durable quilt binding. It is made from a double layer of quilt fabric, either biased or straight of grain, that we fold and then we apply to the quilt and then we bring to the back and hand stitch. I would say it's one of the easier to apply. That being said, I still take forever in doing it. It's a good choice for any type of quilt and it wears well. The single fold binding, I'll be honest, I've used this once, but I do know and have talked to some folks who use it quite often, and there's a time and a place, of course, for it. This type of binding is, as the name suggests, covers the quilt's edge with just a single layer of fabric. It can be made either on the biased or on a straight of grain strips, and it's easy to attach, less bulk. It's good for quilts that will be used lightly, washed infrequently, and here's where it's really good for mini quilts and small projects such as wall quilts. I would not use it on a table runner. You want something much more durable for that. Then there's some alternatives to, there's this technique called self-binding, and I would say it is called, sometimes called edge-turned binding. And this type of binding protects the quilt's edge with just a single layer. And for this method, the backing is trimmed straight, folded, and then wrapped around the front of the quilt and stitched in place to form the binding. It's often thicker. One would say that this is probably one of the original bindings, or at least for me, I remember seeing it often on older quilts. It is great for baby and kids quilts, especially when you use minky, fleece, or flannel in the backing to bring that forward and use that as the binding. Then there's speaking of babies, there's birthing a quilt, which this is a quick method for finishing a quilt's edge. It can be used in combination with prairie points or ruffles, or just as is. The quilt backing is sewn to the quilt top with right sides together, leaving an opening on one side or a partial opening on one side, depending on how large your quilt is, and then turned from inside, back out through that opening slit stitch, opening slip in the stitch. And then quilting can be done after. It's an alternative method for baby, charity, and art quilts. Now let's talk about some specialty bindings. There's prairie points, and I've been meaning to do this on a quilt for a long time. This is going to push me to do so. I'm going to do it on an upcoming quilt, and maybe you'll get a sneak peek, depending on the timing. This is also sometimes called a sawtooth edging, dogtooth borders, or cat's ears. This is where you take folded triangles that are made from either strips of fabric or small squares and scraps to finish the quilt's edge. There's a lot of tools on the market for these to make this binding, I should say, and we're going to cover them in an upcoming week. Prairie points add a great deal of interest with use of color and texture and is a great addition to any quilt. Then there's a ruffled binding. This is definitely depending on whether or not you're making the binding yourself, or whether or not you're going to purchase pre-packaged ruffles. This can be more challenging depending on your approach, whether or not you apply it with more of a traditional binding, or if you do that birthing method. Can make it a little easier, although corners are tough. But it's especially fantastic on baby quilts, doll quilts, and of course pillows. It's just ta-da. You can buy the ready-made, as I talked about, or you can go through, join your fabric end to end, fold it in half, and then gather it by machine. Might be a great use of using your machine for more than just a straight stitch. And this, again, adds a great deal of interest and is great to any edition of quilts. Now there's this face binding that I haven't seen in years, but is starting to make a new surge, or at least I'm more aware of it becoming back in popularity. And this gives a quilt a clean edge without the framing of a traditional quilt binding. The facing is like the binding on the quilt, except for it's turned completely to the back and around the edge of the, completely around the back. So there's no visual line around the edge of the front of the quilt. And then it's hand stitched, and it could be a little easier since you're not worrying about evening, making sure the binding is even on the front and the back. It doesn't have to be exact. And then a lot of people finish it off with this little corner technique that is shown in the picture. And that's also a great opportunity to put a label on. You can use that corner as a label, or corners. It's a really nice finish for our contemporary quilts. So now let's talk about a scalloped binding. A scalloped binding is required when you elect to scallop the border edge. This is often referred to as a curved border. It's where you take a traditional border and you cut it with a curve. There's a lot of math involved in that. Maybe we'll cover that in an upcoming week. It can also be attached to a quilt that has a circular block, such as a double wedding ring quilt. So if you don't want to fuss with putting on a border on a wedding ring quilt, you could do a scalloped binding directly on that block, the edge of that block. They add charm and a bit of whimsy. They can be elegant as well. These must be made with bias cut binding, and it is one of the more difficult binding options. Now there's a flange binding and there's a true flange binding. Everybody knows about the false flange binding, but let's talk first about the flange binding. This is where you have a narrow flap of fabric that you put on right before the binding and can make the binding really pop. I love the look of this double narrow border that a flange makes. So it's great to use when there isn't a border, a true border on a quilt. This can give a little added pop, two colors running along the edge. The flange is made from an extra strip of fabric joined end to end, folded in half and sewn on prior to a traditional binding. Your traditional binding then goes on after, and this gives a three-dimensional flange. And then there's the false flange binding, which is much easier. False, leading the statement there, could be a clue right to that. This allows for a machine finish which might be a more practical use of your time, depending on, what you need, getting it done. It looks a lot neater than a normal sewn binding. It still adds the pop and gives a little dimension. It's not going to give you that 3D dimension per se. And it's especially great on a quilt without a border or a quilt with a matching binding, similar to the flange binding. This is where you join 2 sets of strips prior to attaching the quilt to create one binding strip. You're going to actually sew your binding onto the back of your quilt and then flip it around and then stitch in the flange. And so you can see a little bit here in my picture. This is one that we're going to cover in an upcoming week as well. So decisions. There are endless number of binding options and combinations of bindings. I only covered the ones I'm most familiar with or got questions on. There's no right binding. What you need to decide is, what impact do you want your binding to have on your quilt? Do you want it to blend? Do you want it to pop? Do you want to add some added interest, some added texture? And then you need to think about, do you have the skill set to complete that binding? Because there are endless tutorials online to teach you, but there's nothing more frustrating than being 10 feet from that finishing line and not being able to get across, stumbling. We get frustrated. You might, just for a binding, put the quilt aside, and all that time and effort and money that went into making that quilt could be for naught. So just maybe, and we'll talk about this more in weeks to come, maybe practice on a small piece of quilted fabric before you embark on something that might be a stretch for your skill level. Not saying you shouldn't do it. We should all stretch ourselves. Just saying you should practice on something besides your actual quilt. All right, there are 3 grain lines for binding, 3 different ways you can cut it. There's the cross grain, the bias cut, the straight grain. Let's talk true bias first. So a bias binding is cut on a 45-degree angle from the selvage. There's a special way that you fold it in order to make those cuts. This is truly stretchy, very, very stretchy, and can be used on any edge, but it is especially great for tightly curved edges. Bias binding does use the most amount of fabric, and many fabrics like plaids and stripes can look especially nice when cut with the bias. You do need to take care when you're putting this onto your quilt to make sure that you don't stretch it out of shape. Then there's the cross grain binding. This binding is cut perpendicular to your selvage, basically 90 degrees, and it makes the most economical use of your fabric. Take care to prepare your fabric prior to cutting. You're going to want to open your fabric selvage to selvage, press it, then place that accurate fold. I would tear one side of it first to help give that accurate fold that we covered on prior Tutorial Tuesdays. And you want to make sure that you're cutting straight strips. So anytime we cut strips, we would definitely want to make sure that we've folded and created that true fold. This cut of binding will have some stretch in it, so it can be used for straight edge quilts, mitered corner quilts, or gently curved edges, although I'd be more inclined to use the bias. This is probably the most used, most common, I would say, type of way to cut a binding. Then there's the straight grain binding, also known as lengthwise binding. This is parallel to the selvage of your fabric and has the least amount of stretch of all 3 types. Since this binding is so stable, it's great. It's a great choice for quilts with bias outside edges, and lengthwise grain. The lengthwise grain can stabilize those edges. So it's a good one to use as also if you have a pieced binding prior to that and you didn't put on a little float border. So anytime you have a pieced border that you're not adding a float, I would definitely consider applying a lengthwise binding. And it's ideal when matching your fabric for your border and your binding, and you're already cutting your border in those lengthwise strips. You'll be able to have less piecing of your binding by using that lengthwise cut. So it's a great use of fabric when you're cutting your border lengthwise and matching. Let's talk about calculating binding. We're going to cover the length, and the length is going to hold true no matter which type of binding you're going to put on, aside from curved, that we have to talk about. That's a special case. And then we're going to talk about yardage for the most commonly used, and the first one that we're going to do next week. We'll cover calculating yardage for others based on the technique in future sessions. So first, let's talk about the width of your binding. You need to determine that. There's the traditional method where your strip length, strip width can vary anywhere from 2 to 2.5 inches. I've even heard of people doing it 1 7/8. That's not me. I traditionally cut mine at 2 1/4, and then I just stitch it on with just a hair or thread wider than a 1/4 inch seam. I also use 2 1/4 in my calculations for my patterns. Things to consider is your thickness of your quilt and whether or not you're hand or machine stitching it on, whether or not you need to give yourself a little wiggle room and go with a slightly larger size. The 3/8 and the 1/2 inch for binding, I actually like, or the seam allowance, which gives you that binding. I like to use that on a flannel quilt. Again, you'd want to be careful that you didn't have piecing that had a 1/4 inch finish, a unit that's finishing with only an extra 1/4 inch. You would not want to use a thicker seam allowance on those particular borders. But if you have a plain traditional border, say it's flannel, and you're putting a flannel border on, or excuse me, a flannel binding on, then this is ideal to go with a little thicker seam allowance. Gives you a little thicker binding, which I like on a flannel quilt. All right, so now let's talk about calculating the binding length. We're going to take the dimensions of your quilt. Length plus width times 2 equals quilt perimeter. 92 plus 68 times 2 equals 160 times 2 equals 320 inches. You're then going to add an extra 15 to 20 inches, depending on how much wiggle room you like, as well as getting around those corners. So 320 plus 20 equals 340 inches is needed. Now, for cross grain binding, we're going to figure out how you calculate the yardage. We'll talk about the others in future weeks. So you take the total number of inches needed, divide it by the width of fabric. Most fabric is 40 inches wide, some a little more, some a little less. Normally you have this fabric folded, but I'm just showing you that it's 40 across. So 340 divided by 40 equals 8.5. You want to round up to 9 strips. You want to multiply the number of strips by the width of fabric. So 9 times 2.25, which is the size I decided I wanted to use, equals 20.25. Round up to 21 inches. Divide that 21 inches by 36 to determine your yardage. In this case, it comes out to 0.58, which is 2/3 yard. So selecting your binding fabric, we're going to talk about this in future weeks to come as well, but let's just talk about a little bit of fun here. Sometimes it's nice to match your border. Other times you want a little pop. If you're considering a little pop, think about florals, dots, circles, stripes, checkered, small or multicolored prints, or scrappy. These all add some extra interest to your quilts. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about tools to help you manage your binding and tips for applying a double fold binding. In upcoming weeks, right now I have slated a flange binding, a fake or false flange binding, scalloped or curved binding. Yes, I'm going to probably be pushed into doing so. And then maybe a few more depending on request. So I'm Renee Hiatt. Thank you for joining me for Tutorial Tuesday. And if you're wondering what the quilt is behind me for today's session, it is my ComSeas quilt, which I am currently working on filming a online class for. It's the next to be released. If you want any additional information on my online classes, please go to my website and check out the tab that says workshops, and then you can see virtual as well as online classes. All my online classes are offered through the platform Teachable, which is fantastic. It really breaks it down and allows you and me to set it up where you are watching segments of each of the lessons. I align them to my pattern booklets so that you're easily able to go back and just replay what you need. They're lifetime views, so you can buy it once and watch it over and over again, just segments over and over again, but it's really terrific. I've been really happy with the online classes. I currently have released a monthly technique building series, which we've just started, called Timeless with a Twist. And then I also have just released Sparkle last week as a online class. Both of them offer hours and hours of online step-by-step videos that, again, are segmented so that you can watch just the pieces that you need after you watch it end to end, hopefully. All right, so I'm Michelle Renee Hiatt again. Thank you very much for joining me for Tutorial Tuesday, week 12, and I hope to see you next week. Hope you're all well.